A lonely, dark-skinned widow lived in silence for many years until a storm brought 10 horses loaded with gold to her house. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The wind moved across the plain like a living thing, scraping over the cracked earth and hissing through the brittle grass that clung in stubborn patches near the fence line. It carried with it the taste of dust and salt, settling on Mariah Johnson's tongue as she stood on the porch of her small, weather-beaten house. The boards beneath her feet were warped and sun-bleached, and the once white paint had long since peeled away, leaving behind wood the color of old bones. She leaned against the post, her arms crossed tightly against her chest, and stared out at the land that had once been a dream and now felt like a curse. The horizon was endless, a pale line between the scorched earth and the faded blue of the sky. Nothing broke it except the sagging remains of a fence half a mile out, leaning like a weary man ready to collapse. Beyond that, the pasture was more dirt than grass, dotted here and there with the dull outlines of her remaining cattle. Just 2 cows now, their ribs starkly visible even from this distance. They moved slowly, heads bowed, as though carrying the weight of the same defeat she felt pressing down on her. The old horse, Gideon, stood tethered to the post near the barn, his coat rough, his frame angular with neglect she could no longer afford to mend. Inside the house, the air was stifling. The curtains hung limp and gray, dust thick in the corners like cobwebs that no broom could fully chase away. The furniture was sparse and worn. A rickety table with one uneven leg, 2 mismatched chairs, a bed with a quilt so patched it looked like a map of forgotten roads. The hearth was cold, though the smell of old ash lingered as a reminder of last night's meager fire. There was hardly anything left to burn, but dry fence posts she hadn't yet taken down. Maria stepped back inside and closed the door against the wind, shutting it out like an unwanted guest. The silence was heavy. It pressed in on her as tangibly as the walls themselves, broken only by the faint creak of the rafters and the distant, listless lowing of her cows. It was the kind of silence that could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. She sat down at the table, her hands rough and cracked from work, and rubbed her temples. The ledger lay open in front of her, numbers scrawled across the yellowed paper in a neat, careful hand. What little she had saved was nearly gone. The last sale of milk had barely paid for the feed, and with winter creeping closer, she knew there wouldn't be enough hay to keep the animals alive. There were 2 sacks of flour left, half a jar of beans, and some coffee grounds so old they tasted more like burnt earth than drink. It was barely enough to keep her on her feet. Her gaze drifted toward the photograph on the shelf by the door. The frame was chipped, the glass cracked in the corner, but the image was clear. Her husband, James, in his uniform, smiling the way he used to before the war had taken him from her. She remembered the day he had brought her here, his voice filled with hope as he showed her the land. "It's ours, Maria," he had said, lifting her hand to his lips. "This is where we'll build everything." But James had come home in a coffin draped with a flag, and since then the land had become nothing but a battleground of its own kind. 3 years of windstorms, failed crops, dying stock, and debts that grew no matter how hard she worked. She had promised him she would hold on to this place, that she wouldn't let it go, but the weight of that vow felt heavier with each passing day. Sometimes she thought about leaving. She pictured herself in town, working in the back of the small diner where they'd barely meet her eye, or scrubbing floors for some rancher's wife who'd never let her forget she was lucky to have a job at all. It was the same look she saw in their faces whenever she rode in on market days, their voices low, words sharp but hushed. She's still out there on that place? Alone? Always alone, always with that tone, like they were just waiting for her to fail, for her to sell the land to someone they thought belonged there more than she did. Hank Hadley had been the worst of them and the most persistent. He was the kind of man who sweated even in the cold, his shirts sticking damply to his back and his smile too wide to be anything but false. He had been by 3 times this month already, each visit the same. The cloying tone, the way his gaze slid over her house, her hands, her face, lingering in places that made her skin crawl. "You can't keep this up, Maria," he'd said last time, leaning against his buggy like he owned the very ground he stood on. "You're a woman alone out here. It ain't safe, and it sure ain't smart. Let me take it off your hands before it gets worse." She had told him no, her voice even but tight, and he'd laughed like he knew better. Now, as she sat in the dim light of the afternoon, she thought of that laugh and felt a hot sting of anger under her ribs. She had not broken yet. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her crawl into town and sell the only thing James had ever truly given her. Outside, the wind shifted, rising in pitch as the sun dipped low. The boards on the side of the house groaned and the shutters rattled. She stood and went to them, fastening each one down with the rusted hooks James had hammered in himself. The smell of dust was sharper now, carrying that bitter tang that came before a storm. By dusk, the sky had turned a sickly yellow-gray, the horizon darkened by the wall of grit sweeping toward the ranch. Maria lit the lantern, its glow small and trembling against the encroaching dark, and checked the doors twice before sitting back at the table. The wind screamed louder, a high, keening note that set her teeth on edge. Somewhere outside, Gideon stamped and snorted nervously against his tether. Then she heard it. A sound carried on the wind, faint but sharp, cutting through the storm's howl. At first, she thought it was just debris striking the barn again, but then came another, a hollow, metallic clatter, followed by the unmistakable sound of a horse's frightened whinny. Maria froze. Her breath caught in her throat, listening hard. It came again, closer this time, leather snapping, hooves scraping against wood, and then something heavy hitting the ground. She rose slowly, her chair scraping against the floor, and reached for the rifle propped by the hearth. The wood was cool and smooth beneath her fingers, the metal barrel catching a faint glint from the lantern's light. Her heart thudded in her chest, a steady, measured drumbeat, as she crossed the room and pressed her ear to the door. Outside, the wind roared, and somewhere in its depths, she heard movement that didn't belong to it. With the rifle in one hand and the lantern in the other, she unlatched the door. It swung wide immediately, yanked out of her grasp by the force of the storm, slamming against the wall. The gust slapped her face, filling her mouth and eyes with grit, stealing her breath. She blinked against the stinging dust and peered into the dim chaos beyond her porch. Through the swirling haze of dirt and shadow, she thought she saw shapes moving, low and shrouded, shifting near the barn. The wind wailed, carrying another sound to her ears, the panicked squeal of horses, sharp and desperate, and then a dull, heavy moan that did not belong to any animal. Maria's grip on the rifle tightened. The storm had brought more than just wind tonight. The wind tore at her clothes and stung her skin like 1,000 tiny lashes as Maria forced herself down the porch steps and into the maelstrom. Dust clawed its way into her lungs with every breath, choking and bitter, while her lantern's glow barely reached past her boots. She could feel the rifle's weight steady in her grip, cold and certain, though it was little comfort against the unseen shapes looming in the dark. She pressed her forearm against her face, squinting through the swirling haze, and moved toward the barn. The sounds grew louder as she neared the structure, a frantic symphony of hooves pounding, leather straps snapping taut, and the metallic clink of buckles and stirrups thrashing in confusion. Her pulse quickened. The horses were close, panicked enough to slam against the barn wall, their cries sharp and ragged against the howl of the storm. Then, as she edged closer, she saw him. At first, it seemed like a lump of discarded rags sprawled in the dirt, barely visible in the shifting dust. But, as she drew nearer, she made out the shape of a man, tethered by a tangle of ropes that connected him to a string of horses. His limbs were twisted awkwardly, his clothes soaked and clotted with dirt and blood, his face half buried in the earth. One of the lead ropes ran taut across his chest, jerking him slightly every time the terrified animals pulled. Maria's breath hitched. She had not seen another soul out here in weeks, and now, in the middle of a storm that seemed bent on flaying the land raw, a stranger lay dying on her property. Her grip tightened on the rifle, but instinct pushed her forward. She knelt beside him, the grit scraping her knees through the fabric of her trousers. His skin was cold, clammy beneath her fingertips as she brushed dirt from his face, and she could barely hear the shallow rattle of his breath over the roar of the wind. The horses flinched when she rose and moved toward them, their eyes wide and white in the lantern light. They were powerful animals, broad-shouldered and better bred than anything she'd seen in this region, yet they trembled like leaves. Maria spoke low, her voice nearly swallowed by the storm, murmuring soothing words as she approached the nearest. The animal rolled its eyes, but stilled enough for her to work. Her hands, raw from months of labor, tugged at the knots in the ropes, each one pulled tighter by panic and resistance. It was like unraveling a nightmare. One by one, she freed them, slapping their haunches to drive them toward the side of the barn where its battered wall offered some meager shelter from the wind. 10 of them. 10 strong, exhausted horses, each with a canvas pack strapped over its back, sagging under the weight. She didn't have time to wonder at their number or their fine condition. When the last rope was undone, Maria returned to the man. He hadn't stirred. His head lolled limply when she slipped her hands beneath his arms, and it took every ounce of strength in her body to drag him toward the house. Her boots slipped in the loose dirt, the storm clawing at her every step, but she gritted her teeth and pulled harder. Inch by agonizing inch, she hauled him across the yard, his boots trailing furrows behind them. By the time they reached the porch, her chest burned like fire and her muscles screamed with exertion. With one final heave, she lifted his legs over the threshold and stumbled inside, slamming the door against the howling gale. The sudden quiet was shocking, as though she had plunged under water. Only the storm's muffled roar pressed faintly against the walls now, like a distant growl. Maria dropped the rifle by the door and collapsed beside the man's inert body, panting, her hands trembling. He was filthy, caked with mud and grit, his face smeared with blood from a deep gash above his temple. His clothes were dark and sturdy, travel-worn but expensive, a sharp contrast to the threadbare garments of most men out this way. As she pressed her fingers against his neck, relief flooded her. His pulse was there, faint and uneven but present. She fetched the basin from the corner and poured in what little water she could spare from the barrel. It wasn't much, but enough to clean him up enough to see the wounds clearly. The lantern light flickered over his features. High cheekbones, a rough jaw shadowed with days of stubble, and an expression etched even in unconsciousness with tension. He was heavy-set, but not soft, his muscles corded from a life of labor or violence. Maria worked quickly, cutting away torn fabric with an old knife and cleaning the gash on his temple. The sight of it turned her stomach, but she pressed on, dabbing away the blood, rinsing out grit. Her hands were steady even when her mind screamed at her to be cautious. Whoever he was, this man hadn't gotten here by accident. No one simply wandered onto her land, tethered to 10 horses in the middle of a storm, unless something had gone terribly wrong elsewhere. After stitching the wound with the needle and thread she'd boiled over the fire, she cleaned the scrapes along his arms and wrapped his ribs with strips of clean cloth. His breathing stayed shallow but regular. When she brushed a damp lock of dark hair from his forehead, she felt the chill in his skin and quickly draped him in a heavy quilt, tucking it snugly beneath his chin. Then she turned her attention to the horses. She couldn't leave them out in the storm. Grabbing her shawl, Maria braved the gale again, her lantern guttering as she stumbled toward the barn. The animals shifted nervously as she led them inside one by one, speaking in soft tones they couldn't hear over the wind, but perhaps felt in her hands. Their packs were still strapped to their backs, bulging and heavy. When she unfastened the first strap, the canvas split slightly under her fingers, revealing something that caught the lantern light and glittered faintly. Her breath froze. She reached inside, and her fingertips brushed against rough, jagged stone. She drew it out. It was heavy, veined through with dull yellow metal that gleamed unmistakably even in the dim glow. Gold. Her heart pounded. There wasn't just one rock. There were dozens stuffed inside the torn bag, and if this one was like the rest, every pack on every horse was filled the same way. 10 horses, 10 packs. Enough wealth to buy 100 ranches like hers and to draw death straight to her door if anyone knew it was here. She shoved the stone back inside, her hands trembling. This was no ordinary traveler. When she returned to the house, she locked the door, dropped the bolt into place, and glanced at the stranger lying by her hearth. His face was pale and slack, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Maria sat in the chair beside him, the rifle resting across her lap. Outside, the wind screamed and clawed at the walls, rattling the shutters in their frames. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a small island against the chill that seemed to have seeped into her bones. She stared at the man, at the lines of strain in his brow even as he slept, and felt a gnawing unease curl tighter in her gut. This storm had brought more than dust. It had carried a stranger and a secret that could shatter the fragile world she'd been clinging to. And as the night wore on and the storm raged outside, Maria realized she wasn't sure whether she had rescued this man or invited danger straight into her home. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt unnatural. The air was clearer than it had been in weeks, sharp and cold, carrying the scent of dust that had settled heavily over everything. Maria stood on her porch, wrapped in her shawl, staring out across the land. The sky was washed pale, streaked with faint lavender and gold, and the fields lay quiet under a fine layer of grit that sparkled in the early light. It should have been peaceful, but she felt none of the peace. Her gaze kept drifting toward the barn, where the 10 horses rested, their packs still hidden under heavy canvas. Inside the house, the stranger lay unmoving on the quilt she had spread before the fire. His breathing was steady but shallow, each inhale faint, each exhale a whisper. Through the night, he had stirred only in fevered bursts, mumbling words she couldn't quite catch. Once, she'd leaned close and heard a name, Elijah, spoken in a voice thick with pain and memory. Another time he'd muttered about the hills and something being gone. His face, damp with sweat, looked younger in those moments, the hard lines of his jaw softened by fever. Maria had sat beside him for hours, watching the flicker of firelight trace over his features while exhaustion gnawed at her. Her thoughts spun endlessly, about the horses, about the heavy packs that contained a fortune she didn't understand, about the man himself, and what kind of trouble he might bring down on her. She thought of the way the town would react if they knew, how quickly whispers traveled and how fast greed turned friendly faces into wolves. Out here, news didn't just move fast, it twisted and grew teeth. By mid-morning, she decided she couldn't leave the horses where they were. The barn was too exposed. Anyone cresting the ridge could see the movement, and she knew that sooner or later someone would ride by. Slinging the rifle over her shoulder, Maria trudged back into the chill and led the horses out in small groups. They were tired, their coats damp with sweat dried by the storm, but they followed her with heavy, resigned steps. There was a narrow ravine half a mile behind the ranch, lined with scrubby brush and sheltered enough that it stayed out of sight from the main road. It was the kind of place James used to talk about using for shelter in bad weather, though they'd never had cause to. Maria guided each horse down the uneven slope, tying them near a shallow spring where hardy patches of grass clung to life. It took hours to move all 10, the work slow and grueling, but she felt a small relief once they were hidden away from sight. When she returned to the house, sweat sticking her hair to her forehead despite the chill in the air, she found the stranger tossing restlessly. His fever had deepened, his lips dry and cracked. She soaked a rag in cool water and pressed it to his forehead, coaxing him to drink what little he could swallow. Again he murmured, "Elijah," followed by something like "mine" or "ours," his words blurred and broken. Maria frowned, wondering who this Elijah was. A brother, maybe? Her thoughts were interrupted by the crunch of wheels on dry dirt. She froze, heart thudding as she glanced out the front window. A buggy rolled up the path, drawn by a stout bay horse, and seated atop it was Hank Hadley. His hat was tilted low against the sun, his cheeks flushed in that constant, sweaty way of his. Maria set the rag down and squared her shoulders, feeling the familiar knot of irritation tighten in her chest. When Hadley stopped in front of the porch and climbed down, his boots hitting the ground with a puff of dust, she stepped outside to meet him. "Mornin', Mrs. Johnson," he said in his usual syrupy tone, pulling off his hat. His small eyes flicked past her, scanning the yard as though cataloging every detail. "That was quite a storm last night. Hope you held up all right out here." "We managed," Maria replied curtly, blocking the doorway. Her use of "we" was deliberate. Hadley's gaze lingered on her for a moment, sharp and probing. "We, huh?" he said with a small smirk, shifting his weight and looking toward the barn. "Funny. I thought I heard horses in the night, but maybe that was just the wind." Her grip tightened on the edge of her shawl. "You thought wrong." He chuckled, the sound oily. "I'm just looking out for you, Maria. Lot of talk in town lately about drifters. Some folks say a gang's been moving through the hills, roughing up prospectors and taking whatever they find. Dangerous men. You wouldn't want that trouble showing up at your door." His smile widened, teeth too bright in the sun. "All the more reason to consider my offer. Sell me the land, move into town where it's safe. You'd sleep easier." Maria stared at him, holding back the words she wanted to spit. He had no idea how close trouble already was. Behind her, inside the cabin, an unconscious stranger lay on her floor, bleeding secrets into her home. Outside, 10 stolen horses loaded with gold were hidden in a ravine that, if found, could get her killed. And here stood Hank Hadley, playing his tired game as though he were the only threat she had to worry about. "Thank you for your concern," she said evenly, forcing calm into her voice. "But I'm fine here. Always have been." Hadley tilted his head, clearly dissatisfied. "Suit yourself," he drawled, though his eyes still lingered on her house with an expression that made her skin crawl. He climbed back onto the buggy and flicked the reins. But as he rode off, she noticed him glance over his shoulder once, his gaze lingering a moment too long. When he was gone, Maria shut the door and bolted it. The stranger stirred again, his fever breaking into a sheen of sweat. This time his words were clearer, though faint. "Elijah, gone. They took it." His face twisted in anguish. Maria leaned closer. "Who's Elijah?" she asked quietly, though she knew he couldn't hear her. He muttered again, "Fletcher, Hills, Gold," before falling silent, his breath shallow but steady. The name Fletcher stuck in her mind like a burr. She didn't know it, but it carried an edge that made her stomach knot. Whoever Fletcher was, she had no doubt he was tied to the fortune hidden in her barn and now buried in the ravine. That night, as darkness fell over the land, Maria sat near the fire with the rifle across her knees, watching the stranger. The house felt different now, heavier somehow, as though every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the shutters carried meaning. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridges and the thin line of horizon, men were likely hunting for what lay in her cellar. As the embers burned low, she thought of James, of the promise she had made him to keep this land alive. Now, that promise felt tangled in something larger, something dangerous and wild. She glanced at the man on the floor, his brow furrowed even in unconsciousness, his face pale against the flicker of the firelight, and she wondered what storms were still to come. The land had always demanded more than it gave, but tonight it felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for whatever would arrive next. And Maria, despite herself, could feel it too. By the third morning, Maria woke to the sound of movement that was not her own. It was faint at first, a shifting of blankets, a low, muffled groan, but it was enough to jolt her from the uneasy half-sleep she had drifted in and out of near the fire. She pushed herself upright, her body stiff from nights spent on the hard-backed chair, and turned toward the figure lying on the floor. He was propped on one elbow now, eyes open, their dark gaze sharp even beneath the lingering haze of fever. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet between them was taut, humming like a drawn wire. "You're awake," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. He studied her, his eyes flicking across the room, taking in the hearth, the rifle resting nearby, the shuttered windows, and then returning to her face. His voice came low and rough, like gravel dragged across stone. "Where am I?" "My ranch," Maria replied. She rose from her chair and poured a small tin cup of water from the basin, handing it to him. "You were tied up to a string of horses out by my barn. The storm nearly buried you." He took the cup in trembling hands, drank greedily, and then wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist. There was a rawness in his movements, a wariness too. "The horses?" he asked. "They're safe," she said evenly, watching him closely. "And the packs?" His tone sharpened slightly. Maria hesitated. The words felt heavy in her throat, but she forced them out. "Safe as well." He held her gaze a long moment, then gave a slow, single nod, as if weighing her response and deciding, for now, not to press further. "Name's James Colder," he said. His voice still carried that rasp, though it steadied with each word. I owe you thanks, seems like." Maria didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to the hearth, stirring the pot of thin stew she'd set over the embers earlier. The scent of beans and wild onion filled the room, humble but warm. She ladled a portion into a bowl and handed it to him. He ate with deliberate slowness, each bite measured, though she could see the hunger in the way he scraped the spoon against the bottom. When he'd finished, he set the bowl aside and leaned back against the wall, his gaze fixed on her. "I won't stay long," he said, "just until I'm steady enough to ride." Maria crossed her arms. "And what about the men hunting you?" His expression hardened, shadows darkening the planes of his face. "Fletcher," he said, the name a curse on his tongue. "Him and 2 others. They won't stop until they've taken back what's in those packs, and they'll kill anyone in their way." Her stomach tightened. She had guessed as much, but hearing it aloud brought the danger into sharp relief. "Then we'd best be ready," she said simply. James studied her, something like surprise flickering in his eyes, then approval. "You've got grit," he murmured. "That'll help." They spent the day preparing. James, though still weak, moved with a deliberate, methodical purpose, his every step measured. He walked the perimeter of the ranch with her, noting the sagging stretches of fence and the narrow gullies that could provide cover. He pointed out the spots where the land dipped enough to hide a man, where a shooter could settle unseen with a clear line of sight to the house. Maria listened, absorbing his instructions, and followed his lead, even when her arms ached from lifting boards or her fingers burned from hammering nails into stubborn wood. The house, for all its wear, was sturdily built, its thick walls a holdover from better times. Together, they reinforced the doors, bolted the shutters, and cleared the clutter near the windows so nothing would block their view. James showed her how to stack firewood in a barricade along the entry, tight enough to slow anyone who forced their way in. When the sun dipped low, they turned their focus to the weapons. Maria brought out the old rifle that had belonged to James, her James, not this stranger, and set it on the table. Its wood was scuffed, the metal dulled from years of neglect, but James Calder's hands treated it with reverence. He dismantled it with practiced ease, cleaning each piece until it gleamed faintly in the lamplight, then reassembled it smoothly. "Ever shot before?" he asked. Maria shook her head. "Not since I was a girl. My father taught me some, but it's been years." "Then we'll fix that," he said. Out behind the house, with the sky streaked in bruised purples and deepening blue, James handed her the rifle. "Feet apart," he instructed, guiding her stance. "Loosen your shoulders, don't fight it. When you aim, breathe out slow and steady. Let the sight settle, then squeeze, don't jerk." She did as he said, lining up the old fence post 50 yards out in her sights. The first shot kicked her shoulder back sharply, the sound echoing across the barren land, but the bullet struck close to the mark. By the 4th shot, the recoil no longer made her flinch, and James's small nod of approval sparked a warmth in her chest she hadn't felt in months. By nightfall, her shoulder ached, but she could hit the post cleanly every time. James showed her how to reload without looking, how to keep her movements smooth even under pressure. "Fear makes you clumsy," he said. "Best cure for that is repetition." Inside, the fire burned low as they ate their supper in silence, the sound of spoons against bowls their only conversation. There was no need for words. The air between them had shifted. Where once there had been suspicion and unease, now there was the quiet bond of shared purpose. After they'd eaten, James rose and walked to the window, parting the curtain just enough to glance outside. "They'll come soon," he said. "Fletcher doesn't give up." His voice carried no fear, only certainty. Maria joined him, staring out at the moonlit expanse of land. The horizon was empty, but she felt it too. A pressure, like the world holding its breath. Somewhere out there, beyond sight, danger was moving closer. "We'll be ready," she said. James looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the faint glow of the firelight. He gave a single nod, the smallest ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. That night, as Maria lay in bed for the first time in days, sleep did not come easily. She heard every sound, the creak of the timbers, the distant cry of a coyote, the sigh of wind through the eaves. Yet, beneath it all was a strange steadiness, an anchor she hadn't known she needed. There was no undoing what had come to her door, no turning back from it. And for the first time since James's death, she didn't feel entirely alone. Outside, beyond the ridges, a thin thread of smoke rose into the night sky, far off but visible in the moonlight. Maria saw it in her dreams, curling upward like a warning. The men who sought Fletcher's gold were closer now, and the land, so long silent, seemed to hum in anticipation of the storm it knew was coming. The smoke they had seen the previous evening did not fade with the dawn. By morning it was gone from the horizon, but Maria knew that only meant whoever had made that fire had moved on. She rose early, drawn from her bed by a restless unease that had grown heavier in her chest through the night. The light outside was brittle, sharp-edged, and the sky had the pale, washed look of late autumn, as if it had been scoured clean by the winds. James was already up, sitting at the table with his revolver disassembled before him, each piece lined neatly in order on the wood. He glanced up when she entered, nodded once, then returned his attention to the work of oiling and checking every part. His movements were slow and exacting, the kind of methodical precision born not from habit, but from necessity. "They'll come tonight," he said without looking up. His voice carried no hesitation, just a grim acceptance. Maria stood at the window, her fingers tightening in the fabric of her shawl. The world outside seemed unnaturally still, even the wind muted to a faint whisper across the dry grass. The air held the sharp scent of dust and the lingering chill of early morning. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears, making every creak of the floorboards and every shift of her own breath sound loud enough to betray her. She turned back to him. "Are you certain?" James glanced up at her, his dark eyes steady. "I saw fresh tracks when I checked the north ridge. 3 sets of horses. They're circling, watching. They know we're here. They'll wait for nightfall." The matter-of-fact way he said it sent a shiver up her spine. She nodded once, then busied herself with preparations, more for something to do than from any lack of readiness. The day passed in a tense, taut rhythm. She drew buckets of water from the well until her shoulders ached, filling every pot and basin in the house. James stacked firewood against the walls inside, enough to barricade the doors if it came to that. They moved through their tasks without wasted words, their silences heavier now but somehow unified, each of them carrying the knowledge of what the other was thinking without needing to speak it. By mid-afternoon, James took her out to the far side of the barn, where the old fence line ran jagged and broken, and handed her the rifle. She practiced again, steadying her breath, aiming at fence posts until her shoulder throbbed from recoil. He corrected her stance when she faltered, his hands firm but brief on her shoulders, his voice low and even. "Breathe out. Don't fight it. Let it break clean." When her shots began striking the same spot, he gave a single approving nod. Back inside, they barred the shutters and extinguished the lanterns until only the faint glow of the hearth remained. The walls of the cabin seemed closer now, the air heavy with smoke and anticipation. Outside, the sun sank behind the ridge, turning the horizon to a deep burnished red before fading into shadow. Maria sat at the table with her rifle laid across her knees, feeling its weight as both comfort and burden. James paced once through the room, checked the bolt on the door, then stood near the window, peering out through a narrow crack. Darkness came swiftly, swallowing the plains until the only light came from the thin crescent moon hanging low in the sky. That was when Maria heard it. The faint, distant creak of saddle leather, the muffled clop of hooves on dry ground. She froze, her breath catching. James tilted his head slightly, listening, and then without a word he slipped toward the door, crouching low. The sounds grew clearer. 3 riders, just as he'd said, moving slow and deliberate. Their shadows stretched long across the pale moonlight, dark figures against the open land. They halted 100 yards out, the faint silhouettes of their horses stamping restlessly. "Stay low," James whispered, his voice barely audible. Maria crouched near the window, peering through the narrow slit. The men dismounted. She could see them now, 3 figures moving apart, spreading in a careful arc. They moved with practiced ease, keeping to cover where they could, crouching low as they advanced. One carried a rifle slung across his shoulder. The other 2 held pistols drawn. Their leader, she guessed, was the one in front, a broad-shouldered man whose stride carried a cruel kind of confidence even at a distance. "Fletcher," James muttered. His hand tightened around the revolver grip. A voice rang out then, harsh and mocking, cutting through the silence of the night. "James, I know you're in there." The words carried on the still air, cold and taunting. "Come on out, and we'll make it quick. Don't make us drag it out for her sake." Maria's breath stuttered in her chest. James didn't move. He crouched beside the door like a shadow carved from stone, his expression unreadable. "Don't answer," he whispered to her. "He wants you scared, wants me desperate." Another shout came. "Send 'em out, lady. Hand 'em over and we'll leave you be. That gold ain't worth dying for." Fletcher's voice dripped false assurance, the tone of a man used to breaking others down with words alone. Maria's heart pounded. She thought of Hadley's condescending smile, of the pitying looks in town, of every whispered doubt she had carried alone since James's death. She felt the weight of the rifle in her hands and gripped it tighter. A gunshot cracked suddenly, sharp and violent. The sound split in the air. The bullet struck the cabin's front wall with a splintering snap, wood chips flying. Maria ducked instinctively, pressing herself against the floorboards. Her pulse thundered in her ears. "They're testing us," James said, his voice low but steady. He glanced toward her, his expression hardening. "Get ready." The second shot came closer, shattering glass as it tore through the window frame inches above her head. Maria gasped, adrenaline spiking sharp and cold in her veins. James leaned up just enough to fire back through the crack, his revolver roaring once, twice, sending sparks flashing in the darkness outside. One of the attackers dove for cover, vanishing behind the old watering trough. Maria shifted to the side window, her breath tight. Through the narrow slit, she saw one of them creeping closer, crouched low in the grass. He moved with a hunter's precision, silent and lethal. She raised the rifle, steadying her breath as James had taught her. The world seemed to narrow to that single shape in the dark, the cold steel beneath her cheek, the rhythmic pounding of her own heart. She exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked loud and final. The man jerked violently and collapsed, his body crumpling into the dirt with a dull thud. A shout rang out, raw and furious. The leader's voice, no longer taunting but sharp with rage. You'll pay for that." Gunfire erupted then, a chaotic volley that hammered against the cabin walls. Bullets splintered wood, punched holes through the shutters. Maria pressed herself low, reloading with trembling fingers, the acrid stench of gunpowder thick in the air. James returned fire through another window, his shots measured, forcing their attackers to scatter for cover. The fight became a brutal rhythm of noise and silence. They traded fire, crouching low between volleys, shifting positions to keep the attackers guessing. Maria's shoulder throbbed from the rifle's recoil. Her ears rang with every shot, but she held her ground. Then James turned to her, his expression grim. "I'm going out the back," he said. "What?" "I can flank them from the barn. They're focused on the front. Keep firing. Make them think we're both still here." Fear surged sharp in her chest, but she saw the certainty in his eyes, the cold focus of a man who had done this before. She nodded once. He slipped out the back window like a shadow, vanishing into the darkness. Maria crawled to the front window, fired again toward the watering trough where Fletcher was pinned. The return fire came wild, desperate, and she pressed herself low, reloading by touch as James had drilled her. Minutes stretched like hours. Her breath came harsh and ragged, her hands slick with sweat despite the cold. Then, over the din of gunfire, came a new sound. The panicked scream of horses from the ravine beyond the barn. Maria's heart leapt. James's diversion. Fletcher and his remaining man jerked their heads toward the sound, confusion breaking their focus. That was when James struck. A single shot rang out from the shadows near the barn, sharp and final. One of the men cried out, collapsing where he stood. Fletcher spun, firing wildly toward the barn's dark shape, exposing himself fully. Maria seized her chance. She steadied her breath, aimed through the narrow slit, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, the recoil slamming into her bruised shoulder. Fletcher jerked backward, staggered, then fell heavily into the dirt, motionless. The silence that followed was deafening. Maria stayed crouched, her body trembling, the rifle still pressed tight to her shoulder. The world outside seemed to hold still. Every sound vanished but for the ragged rush of her own breath. Slowly, cautiously, she rose and peered through the window. 3 bodies lay sprawled in the moonlight, dark stains seeping into the pale dirt. Beyond them, the open plain stretched silent and empty under the cold glow of the moon. A shape emerged from the shadows near the barn. James, revolver in hand, his face streaked with dirt but whole. He moved with weary certainty toward the cabin, glancing once at the fallen men before climbing the porch steps. Maria unbolted the door and stepped back as he entered. They stood there for a long moment in the smoky, gunpowder-stained air, the wreckage of the night around them. No words were spoken. None were needed. The fight was over, but neither of them mistook it for an ending. Outside, under the pale moonlight, the land was quiet once more, but it was no longer the same silence Maria had known before. It was a silence earned, heavy with the weight of what they had done and the danger they had survived. James closed the door and dropped the bolt. His shoulders sagged, exhaustion written in every line of him. Maria, gripping the rifle tightly, exhaled a long, shuddering breath and felt, for the first time in years, not fear, but something fiercer. Resolve. The night had taken its toll, but it had not broken her. And somewhere, deep inside, she knew that this was only the beginning. The first light of dawn crept across the plains, pale and muted, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise over the aftermath of the night. The cabin smelled of gunpowder and smoke, a harsh scent that clung to the walls and seemed to seep into the very floorboards. Maria stood at the window, her fingers resting lightly against the wooden frame as she looked out at the stillness beyond. The ground outside bore the scars of what had happened: splintered wood from shattered shutters, small pockmarks in the dirt where bullets had struck, and farther out, the shapes of the 3 men they had dragged into shallow graves before dawn. James had been the one to take them out, one by one, silent and determined as he worked by lantern light. Maria had followed him, holding the lamp steady while he shoveled, her hands gripping the handle tighter than necessary to stop their trembling. The work had been grim and exhausting, but neither of them spoke. The only sounds had been the scrape of metal against earth, the dull thud of dirt falling over bodies, and the wind sighing low across the empty land. Now, with the graves covered and marked only by bare mounds of disturbed soil, the land seemed to hold its breath once more, a quiet waiting that pressed against her chest. Inside, James sat at the table, his revolver laid aside at last. His face was drawn, streaked faintly with grime from the night before, but his eyes were steady, watchful. He looked older in that morning light, not from years, but from the weight of what they had endured together. Maria turned to him, her own body heavy with exhaustion, her muscles aching from the strain of battle and burial alike. She crossed the room slowly, the floor creaking beneath her bare feet, and lowered herself into the chair across from him. For a while, they simply sat there in silence. The pot of coffee she had brewed over the rekindled fire sent thin curls of steam into the air, filling the cabin with a smell far more comforting than anything else. James reached for his cup, wrapping his scarred hands around it, and drank deeply. Maria followed suit, the warmth spreading through her as though it could burn away the chill that had settled into her bones overnight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, but there was a rawness to it she hadn't heard before. "That gold," he said, glancing toward the cellar door. "It belonged to my brother, Elijah. We worked the claim together high up in the hills. Took us years to find it, but when we did—" He paused, staring into his cup for a moment, as though he could see it all there. "Fletcher and his men came out of nowhere, killed him, took everything. I barely got away alive." Maria's chest tightened. She remembered the fevered whispers of that name, Elijah, spoken in his delirium, and the pain that had clung to it even in unconsciousness. "You took it back," she said softly. James nodded once. "I tracked them for weeks, waited for the chance, struck while they were drunk and careless. Took the gold and the horses. Thought I was clear, but they caught up faster than I expected. You know the rest." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I didn't want to bring that fight here, but I'm grateful you didn't turn me away." Maria met his gaze. There was something steady in his eyes now, a kind of anchored strength that made her stomach unclench just a little. "You didn't give me much of a choice," she said with a faint, tired smile. A ghost of amusement flickered across his face, but it faded quickly, replaced by something more serious. "It's yours now too, you know," he said. "That gold. Fletcher's men are gone, and I can't take it back up into those hills alone. I wouldn't even if I could. You saved my life. You've earned it as much as I have." Maria looked toward the cellar as he spoke, though the door was closed and its contents hidden beneath the floor. The thought of it, the weight of those canvas packs, the gleam of that yellow metal, felt unreal even now. She imagined what it could do, not just for her survival, but for the ranch, for the land James had left her that had been choking her in debt and despair. With that gold, she could mend the roof properly instead of patching it with scrap wood. She could repair the fence lines, buy new stock, even hire hands to help her work the soil back to life. But more than that, it was the first time she felt something she hadn't dared to in years. Possibility. "I don't care about the gold," she said finally, surprising herself even as the words left her mouth. "Not for its own sake. I care about what it means. I care about keeping this place alive." James studied her quietly, then nodded, as though that was exactly the answer he'd expected. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. "We." The word settled between them like a promise. They spent the rest of the morning walking the property together. Maria showed him the fence lines in disrepair, the sagging roof of the barn, the pump that leaked more than it gave. James pointed out how they might fix things, where to shore up weak spots, how to redirect runoff from the dry creek bed, which sections of land could be cleared for planting again come spring. His practical eye saw every flaw she'd long since grown numb to, but he didn't speak of them with pity or derision. He spoke like a man planning to stay. When they returned to the cabin, Maria found herself looking at him differently. He had moved through the morning with quiet confidence, steadying everything around him simply by being present. For so long, she had borne everything alone. The land's relentless hunger, the condescension of townsfolk, the gnawing grief of James's death. Now, standing shoulder to shoulder with this man who carried his own scars but did not flinch from hers, she felt some of that crushing weight lift. By midday, they had settled on their plan. The gold would be used carefully, hidden from prying eyes in town. A few head of cattle here, new tools there, supplies enough to repair the barn and replace the broken plow. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that would draw suspicion. James would ride into town when necessary, keeping her name out of it as much as possible, and they would slowly piece the ranch back into something living and whole. As the sun dipped lower, casting long golden rays across the land, Maria stood on the porch and looked out over the horizon. The graves of Fletcher's men lay quiet in the distance, their mounds stark but unmarked, reminders of the danger that had passed and the cost it had demanded. Yet, beyond them, the plains stretched wide and open, touched by light that seemed softer now, warmer somehow. James joined her there, standing just close enough that their shoulders brushed. He looked out at the same horizon, his expression unreadable for a long moment before he spoke. "This is good land," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "It just needs time and faith." Maria felt her throat tighten. The words were so close to the ones her husband had once spoken to her, on the very day they'd first stood here together. For a heartbeat, she felt James's presence too. The other James, the man she had buried, whose dream she had kept alive through grit and grief. But this time, she did not feel haunted by it. Instead, it felt like a torch passed from one set of hands to another, a dream too stubborn to die. She glanced at the man beside her. "Then let's give it both," she said. He turned to her then, and in his eyes she saw something unspoken but undeniable. Not just gratitude, but the same fierce determination she felt in her own chest. That night, they sat together by the fire, the cabin quiet except for the crackle of flames and the distant whisper of wind outside. There was no fear in that silence anymore, no crushing loneliness. There was only purpose, shared and steady. For the first time in years, Maria felt not just like a woman surviving day to day, but like someone who could build. someone who could take this battered land and make it live again. And as the firelight danced over the walls and the wind rustled gently through the dry grass beyond, she knew this was the beginning of something new. Not just for the ranch, but for herself. When she closed her eyes that night, she dreamed not of storms or graves or debts, but of spring, of green shoots breaking through dry earth, of fresh boards on sturdy fences, of laughter carried on warm breezes. The land had taken so much from her, but now, at last, it felt like it might give something back. And, in that dream, she was not alone. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Watch our other videos for more, and share this one with your friends so they can enjoy it too.